Okay, so you know how sometimes we hear about city budgets and finances and all that, and it can kind of feel like,
Whole other language.
yeah, exactly. Like, does it really even affect us day to day? But honestly, understanding even just the basics of how our cities here in Deer Park, LaPorte, and Pasadena handle their money can be a huge step towards making our community even better.
It's like empowers us, right, to make informed decisions about where we live.
Exactly.
Okay.
So for this deep dive, we're going to try to break down some of those key financial concepts, make them real for you.
And to help us do that, we've been looking at this really interesting conversation with Shane Kavanagh, Senior Manager of Research at GFOA.
GFOA.
Yeah, the Government Finance Officers Association. Basically, it's the group for all the folks who handle the money at the city and state level. They've been around forever, since 1906, and their mission is all about helping communities thrive, through good public finance. They offer training, resources, best practices, all that good stuff.
So basically, they're like the go-to experts for all things local government finance.
Pretty much.
Got it. So our goal today is to take what we learned from Shane and make it relevant for you, our listeners, right here in Southeast Houston.
Yeah, we want to demystify those financial decisions happening in our cities and maybe even get you thinking about how you can get more involved locally because, it's your community, your tax dollars at work.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things that really stood out to me from Shane's interview was how he described the changing role of the finance officer. We often picture someone stuck in a back office just crunching numbers all day.
Oh, yeah, the classic bean counter stereotype, right?
Right. But Shane actually presented a much more dynamic view. He called the modern finance officer a decision architect.
Decision architect, I like that.
Me too. It really emphasizes that it's not just about keeping track of past spending, but about setting the stage for smart financial decisions in the future.
So they're like shaping the environment for better decision making.
Exactly. And he talked about how a big part of that is helping elected officials, our mayors and city council members, avoid some of the common traps people can fall into when making choices. Like, have you ever heard of narrow framing?
Narrow framing? Maybe. Refresh my memory.
So it's basically when you only see two options, like either, when there might actually be a whole bunch of other possibilities.
Yeah, okay, I get it. Like tunnel vision.
Exactly. And a good finance officer can help expand that vision, present a wider range of choices for those officials to consider. So next time you see your city council debating, say, spending cuts, think about whether they're only looking at two options or if they've got a full menu of choices on the table.
That's a good point. I'll have to pay attention to that next time we're at a council meeting.
Definitely. And then there's something called confirmation bias, which is basically the tendency to only look for information that supports what you already believe.
Oh, yeah. I know that one all too well. We all do it, right?
We do. But in the context of city finances, it can be a real problem. So the finance officer has a role in encouraging a more rigorous approach, like pushing people to question their assumptions, look at evidence from other communities, and just make sure decisions are grounded in reality, not just preconceived notions.
So kind of like a reality check, making sure everyone's looking at the full picture.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's a much more strategic role than just crunching numbers. It's about really shaping how financial decisions get made. Now, obviously, when we talk about these decisions, budgets and financial reports are a huge part of the equation. Shane talked about what the GFOA does in that area.
They're a great resource. They provide tons of best practices and guidance on pretty much everything, from budgeting and accounting to managing investments and debt, and even planning for those big infrastructure projects, the roads, bridges, all that stuff. But it's important to note that GFOA doesn't actually set the rules. They don't have the authority to say, you must do it this way.
Right. So who does set the rules?
Well, there's another group, the Government Accounting Standards Board, GASB for short, and they're the ones who establish the actual accounting rules that governments have to follow.
So GSB sets the baseline, the must-dos, and then GFOA comes in and says, okay, now here are some best practices to take it a step further.
Exactly. Think of it like GSB makes sure the city's books are accurate and can be audited, and GFOA then says, here's how to manage that money really well, above and beyond just the bare minimum. Shane referred to this as soft law, emphasizing that adopting these best practices is voluntary, but highly recommended.
So it's like GSB is the law, and GFOA is the friendly advisor saying, hey, This is how you can really make the most of your money.
Precisely. And what's really interesting is that GFOA isn't just about sticking with the old ways of doing things. They're actively looking for new and better approaches. Shane talked about their Rethinking projects, which cover budgeting, financial reporting, and even revenue generation.
Rethinking, huh? Sounds pretty ambitious.
It is. They're really trying to shake things up and find new ways to tackle the challenges that cities face.
You know, the Rethinking Budgeting project really caught my eye. Shane used this analogy of the tragedy of the commons to describe how the local government budget works. I thought that was fascinating. Can you explain that a little more?
Sure. The basic idea is that just like a shared pasture that can be overgrazed if everyone just acts in their own self-interest, the city budget can get strained if every department just focuses on getting as much funding as possible. It's like if no one thinks about the overall health of the budget, it can get depleted pretty quickly.
Oh, I see. So it's like everyone's trying to grab their piece of the pie without thinking about whether there'll be enough left for everyone else.
Yeah, exactly. And this can lead to what Shane called budget games, which are, well, not the most productive behaviors.
Budget games? Like what?
Well, one common one is padding. Departments might intentionally ask for more money than they actually need, knowing that it'll probably get cut down during negotiations. It's like they're building in a buffer, just in case.
Okay, so I can kind of see the logic there. But what's wrong with a little padding?
Well, the problem is that when every department does it, all that extra padding adds up to a significant chunk of money that could be used more efficiently. Think about it. If every single department asks for, say, 10% more than they really need, that's a lot of wasted potential across the entire city budget.
Yeah, that makes sense. So if every department's playing these budget games, it really distorts the overall picture.
Right, and it can make it harder to make strategic decisions about how to allocate resources. So GFOA is looking at strategies to address this, like creating centralized contingency funds.
Centralized contingency funds, what's that?
Basically, instead of every department having its own little reserve, the city would create a central pool of money to cover unexpected expenses.
Oh, so it's like pooling the risk instead of everyone trying to self-insure.
Exactly. And Shane mentioned that some cities that have done this have saved millions of dollars.
Wow, that's impressive. So it's like trading in a bunch of leaky individual umbrellas for one big, sturdy one that covers everyone.
That's a great way to put it.
Thanks. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the relationship between these finance professionals and the elected officials, the folks who ultimately make the big spending decisions.
Sure. So there's this idea called the policy administration dichotomy. In theory, the elected officials set the policy, the big picture direction, and the professional staff, like the finance officer, carry out those policies. But in reality, it's a lot more blurry than that.
Right, because the finance officer isn't just blindly following orders. They're providing information and context that shapes those policy decisions. Like we talked about with target-based budgeting, it gives departments more flexibility, but it also changes how elected officials allocate funds. It shifts the dynamic.
Absolutely. And this highlights the importance of what's called fiscal fluency.
Fiscal fluency.
Yeah, it basically means being able to communicate complex financial information in a way that anyone can understand. Not just the finance experts, but our elected officials and even us regular folks here in Deer Park, LaPorte, and Pasadena. It's about making those financial reports and budgets understandable and accessible to everyone, and in a timely manner, too. GFOA has actually had challenges to try to find creative ways to explain city finances.
You know, I remember Shane mentioning a great example of this. The city of Arlington created these fun videos explaining their budget, using analogies like cooking shows or the Lego movie.
Oh yeah, I saw those. They were great. Made it so much easier to grasp those budget concepts.
Seriously, why aren't more cities doing stuff like that? Makes you wonder.
Right. It's about meeting people where they are, using language and visuals that make sense.
Absolutely. And Shane also talked about the power of mental models, using familiar comparisons to help people understand financial ideas.
Like that example he gave about rainy day funds.
Oh yeah, the savings account versus insurance policy framing.
Exactly. Often, we think of the city's rainy day fund as its savings account. But that can be misleading because, well, most people think of a savings account as money you can spend.
But a rainy day fund is really more about preparing for emergencies, right?
Right. So GFOA suggests thinking of it more like an insurance policy. It's there to protect us against unexpected events like natural disasters or economic downturns. That small shift in how we frame it can make a big difference in how people, including elected officials, view and use those funds.
It's about choosing the right words to convey the true purpose.
Yeah, and making it relatable. Now, of course, our elected officials come into office with their own priorities. They want to lower taxes, fund specific projects, things that matter to their constituents.
Right, they have agendas, just like anyone else.
Absolutely. And that can sometimes create tension with the finance officer's responsibility to make sure the city's finances are healthy in the long run.
So how do you navigate that?
Well, Shane emphasized the importance of trust between the finance officer and the elected officials. That trust is built through ethical conduct, transparency, and by the finance officer being a reliable advisor.
So it's about building a strong relationship where everyone's working towards the same goals, even if they have different priorities.
Exactly. And one tool that can help with that is long-term financial planning.
Looking beyond just the next year's budget.
Right. GFOA has been advocating for this for a while, and more cities are adopting it. But Shane noted there's still room for improvement. By projecting revenues and expenses over several years, cities can anticipate challenges and make more informed decisions today. It's like looking ahead for potholes in the road so you can avoid them instead of just reacting when you hit one.
So it's about being proactive rather than reactive. Makes sense.
And mental models can be helpful here too. Remember Shane's analogy of pension liabilities being like bad debt on a credit card?
Oh yeah, that was a good one.
It highlights how those unfunded liabilities are like a burden that we need to address, not ignore. Now let's talk about something we hear all the time. Balanced budget. Sounds good, right? Like everything's in order.
Yeah, it has a positive ring to it.
But Shane pointed out that a balanced budget can be misleading if you don't look at the details. Technically, a balanced budget just means your income equals your spending.
Okay, but what's wrong with that?
Well, a city could achieve a balanced budget in a single year by selling off assets or taking on a lot of debt, which might not be sustainable in the long term.
Right, it's like selling your furniture to pay your rent. You might be okay for a month, but then what?
Exactly. And this is why Shane emphasized the importance of strong local financial policies.
So policies that go beyond just that basic definition of a balanced budget.
Right. Cities like ours here in Deer Park, LaPorte, and Pasadena need to establish their own guidelines to make sure financial decisions are sound and sustainable.
So what kind of policies are we talking about?
Well, he mentioned a few key ones. First, a reserve policy that sets a minimum and maximum level for the city's reserves. This ensures there's a safety net without hoarding too much cash.
Okay, so it's like finding that sweet spot. Enough reserves for emergencies, but not so much that it's just sitting there doing nothing.
Exactly. Then there's a policy for one-time revenues. Imagine your city gets a big grant that's a one-time source of money. A good policy would say that money should be used for one-time expenses, not for ongoing programs.
Right, because you don't want to create a situation where you're relying on temporary funding for something that needs to continue year after year.
Exactly. Then there's a policy for volatile revenues, like sales taxes, which can go up and down a lot. The policy might involve setting aside extra money in good years to cushion against potential shortfalls later on. It's like saving for a rainy day, literally.
Smart. So it's all about planning ahead and managing those ups and downs responsibly.
Right. Another important one is a structurally balanced budget policy. This means making sure your ongoing revenues are enough to cover your ongoing expenses and that any one-time revenues are matched with one-time expenditures.
So no using one-time money to fund ongoing programs.
Precisely. And finally, he talked about debt policies, which set local limits on how much debt the city can take on.
So even if the state allows a certain level of debt, the city can choose to be more conservative.
Exactly. It's about setting responsible limits that are appropriate for the community's financial situation. Now, shifting gears again, let's talk about bond ratings. We often hear cities bragging about their bond ratings like, we got an A+ SEC.
Yeah, they make it sound like a big deal.
It is important. A good bond rating generally means that the city is in good financial shape and that the rating agency is confident in its ability to repay its debts.
So if we see Deer Park, LaPorte, or Pasadena boasting about a good bond rating, that's a good sign.
Generally, yes, but it's important to remember that it's not the only indicator of a healthy community. Bond ratings also consider the strength of the local economy, which isn't solely a result of smart financial management. Plus, those ratings are primarily focused on the city's ability to repay its debts, which is related to, but not the same as, the overall well-being of the residents.
Right, so it's one piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture.
Exactly. Now, the conversation also touched on some of the nitty-gritty details of government accounting and infrastructure.
The fun stuff.
Shane briefly explained the difference between cash and accrual accounting without getting too technical.
Good, because I'm not an accountant.
Me neither. Basically, cash accounting is like your personal checkbook. Money in, money out. Accrual accounting tries to match revenues and expenses to the periods when they were actually earned or incurred, which gives a more long-term view of the city's finances. He also talked about the Rethinking Financial Reporting project, which aims to make those reports more useful and understandable for everyone.
So not just for the finance folks, but for elected officials and the public, too.
Exactly. It's about transparency and making that information accessible to everyone who needs it. He also pointed out that different departments within the city government, like finance, engineering, and planning, often work in silos.
Meaning they don't communicate with each other as much as they should.
Right. And that can create problems when we think about big, long-term infrastructure projects. Like the way we account for the depreciation of infrastructure, like roads and pipes, often doesn't reflect how those things actually wear out in the real world.
So the accounting might say one thing, but the reality on the ground is different.
Exactly. This can make it hard to plan for those big replacement costs down the road. And it can also be tricky to account for the long-term costs associated with new developments. The developer might donate the initial infrastructure, but who is going to pay for its maintenance and eventual replacement? Us, the taxpayers.
So it's important to factor in those long-term costs when we're thinking about growth. Not just the upfront expenses, but the ongoing ones, too.
Absolutely. And to address this, GFOA is working on ways to improve communication between departments and find new ways to report financial information. Shane mentioned the city of Burbank, which has an online system that uses AI to provide more up-to-date and accessible data. Pretty cool stuff.
Very cool. Now let's circle back to the Rethinking Budgeting initiative.
Sure. So as we discussed, the main idea is to think of the local government budget as a shared resource that needs to be managed carefully. GFOA is actually using the work of Elinor Ostrom, a Nobel Prize winner, who studied how communities can successfully manage shared resources. They're taking those principles and applying them to public finance.
So it's like finding ways for everyone to work together to ensure the long-term health of the budget, right?
Exactly. And the good news is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. The Rethinking Budgeting framework offers a bunch of tools and ideas that cities can adapt to their own situations. Target-based budgeting is just one example of a more innovative approach. Shane encouraged finance professionals to be more like chefs, not cooks, meaning they should understand the underlying principles and adapt strategies to their local context rather than just blindly following a recipe.
I love that analogy. So it's about being creative and finding what works best for your community. That's empowering.
It is. And this Rethinking Budgeting initiative is officially up and running now. It's being incorporated into GFOA's training and award program, so hopefully we'll start seeing more and more cities adopting these new approaches.
That's exciting. So for our listeners here in Deer Park, LaPorte, and Pasadena, what are the key takeaways from all of this?
Well, first of all, it's about realizing that local government finance is complex, but it's also something we can all understand and engage with.
We don't have to be accountants to have a voice in how our cities manage their money.
Right. It's about understanding the roles of the finance officers and elected officials, the importance of long-term planning, having sound financial policies, and being able to interpret financial information critically.
And knowing that balanced budget doesn't always tell the whole story.
Exactly. We need to look deeper and understand those policies and practices that really contribute to a healthy and sustainable financial future for our communities.
Absolutely. So listeners, we encourage you to think about how all of this applies to our cities here in Southeast Houston and get involved. Talk to your elected officials, ask questions, and make your voice heard.
Your city's finances affect you directly, so don't be afraid to engage.
And if you found this deep dive valuable, if you appreciate what we're doing here at Think and Act Locally to empower residents like yourselves, we would really appreciate your support. You can donate at thinkandactlocally.com/donate. That link will also be in the show notes.
Every little bit helps us continue to provide this information and make a difference in our community.
Now, here's a final thought to leave you with. What one financial policy do you think would make the biggest difference for the future of Deer Park, LaPorte, or Pasadena?
That's a great question to ponder.
It is. Think about it. Talk about it. Maybe even reach out to your elected officials and share your ideas. Until next time.
See you then.